New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos. You can now download a free PDF copy or purchase a beautiful printed edition of Issue 5 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is the end of humanity as we know it. And my guest is my good friend James Tunney. He is the author of many books, including The Mystical Accord, Sutras to Suit Our Times, Lines for Spiritual Evolution. The Mystery of the Trapped Light, Mystical Thoughts in the Dark Age of Scientism. Empire of Scientism, the dispiriting conspiracy and inevitable tyranny of Scientocracy. Tech bondage, slavery of the human spirit. Human entrance to transhumanism, machine merger and the end of humanity. Plantation of the automatons. The mythic aim of AI, maiming the mind, and most recently, AI Posthumanism, a mythic soap opera. James lives in Gothenburg, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, James. It's a pleasure to be with you again. It's been a couple of months, at least, I think, since our last interview. And since then, you've knocked out yet another book.
Yeah, yes, I have indeed. And I'm looking forward to talk with you as always. And it's great to see you again, my friend.
Our topic is the end of humanity as we know it. And the point of view that you take in this view is that the very term postmodernism suggests exactly that, the end of humanity, and that this is something that various groups of people have been planning for a long time.
Yes. So when postmodernism and posthumanism are inherently connected. So I focus on posthumanism, and we've talked before about transhumanism. And in many senses, posthumanism from the 70s was presented as a Promethean project, funnily enough, in its literary context and its philosophical context, to anticipate or describe a range of forces that were happening. And afterwards, there is a momentum for ideological, political reasons to bring that to a head. But it's describing a pre-existing movement that has been happening for at least 100 years now when we look back. But I would trace it much earlier to the very splits in the nature of knowledge and science itself. And even we can see the seeds of some of these issues going back to the time of Benjamin Franklin, for example, and Kant. And Franklin was called the modern Prometheus by Kant, which predated, of course, the 1818 book by Mary Shelley on Frankenstein. And the connection between the names is probably not an accident. So what we have there was this debate in science about, well, what is life? What are people? How do they move? And of course, with the experiments with electricity, they began to say, well, actually, humans are not special. They are capable of being explained in terms of forces. And then, of course, with this Promethean idea where with the kite up in the sky, you can bring down electrical fire, as Benjamin Franklin described it. There was this idea, well, we can take control here. And this Promethean idea has informed the growth of science up to this posthuman idea. And the posthuman idea describes a future where humans don't exist in any way that we recognize them. And they don't exist because there's a move beyond humanism. There's a move beyond the idea of the human. And the human is opened up. Everything is about openness. So the human is opened up to the external. And they're penetrated by the technology in many senses. The border between the human body and mind and the outside world is broken. And anything which can be described in the former way as a human is gone. And also the idea that associate with that is that humans were bad anyway. They're destructive. They've caused all the problems in the world. And that inherent in this is an evolutionary challenge whereby we are changed, we are altered, we are modified into some machine-like consciousness that can be tamed.
Well, we're dealing with very complex ideas. Posthumanism is one of these ideas, but even the term posthumanism is based on the idea of humanism. And I gather from reading your book that there are probably a dozen or more different definitions of humanism, and some of them are at odds with each other.
Yes, the posthumanists pick a very narrow idea of humanism and a very withered view of what that entails. And this is the basis, the foundation of their critique. I believe that they make a straw man of humanism. They caricature it, and they fail to look at the total range of possible descriptions of what humanism is. And even if we look at some of the humanists who I would disagree with, in the sense that they may be evolutionary humanists or whatever, but they recognize a much older pedigree of humanism, going back to the axial age, going back to the ancient Greeks, of course, the Buddha, Christianity. So we're talking about 1,000-year-old tradition, not something in the Renaissance. And even when they come to their critique of Renaissance humanism, they misinterpret in many senses what that humanism was, because they argue that it put humans at the top of the pyramid and that has been the cause of a lot of our problems. But as you know from your talks with Arthur Young and as you know anyway, the concept of the human at the time was embedded in a complex worldview with multiple hierarchies. Certainly the human was unique insofar as that they were a bridge between the higher worlds and the lower worlds. But it didn't exclude other beings. In fact, it explained everything, including the planets, including our relationship with them and how they influence us. So when we come to more recent times, humanism was taken as a political project by some of the people involved in creating the New World Order, H.G. Wells. It was certainly taken by many communists, by many materialists. And if we look at recent discussions on humanism, we can see tensions, for example, between Skinner and Popper, as well as the fact that transhumanism came from a leading humanist. So Julian Huxley was celebrated as an international humanist, and yet he came up with transhumanism, a transitionary phase after humanism. And of course, another champion humanist was B.F. Skinner. And when it came to signing one of the more recent declarations, Karl Popper objected to this. He objected to Skinner being a humanist, and he put this in writing in a letter to humanist organization. He explained that Skinner's version of humanism was a fundamentalism, and he had perceived humanism as anti-fundamentalism. And he believed, in fact, that B.F. Skinner's behaviorism and his version of humanism, with his idea of operant conditioning, was the worst fundamentalism of all, according to the letter. So even within the humanisms, we find tensions. And of course, if we look at in the Marxist perspective, going back to Engels and going back to Trotsky, we see that the human was something to be constructed in the future. It was a collective humanism, which is radically different from any or traditional ideas of humanism. So I say there's a whole range of ideas of humanism, but one thing that has been happening is that the reality of humanism has been contracting. It's been restricted. It's been desupernaturalized, dispirited, and it's been reduced to something materialist so that it can be changed and altered again with technology. And I believe that you have had contact with some of these tensions in your own career, and particularly in the context of Skinner, as far as I understand.
Well, it's true. I was very active for a long time with the Association for Humanistic Psychology. And Skinner was diametrically opposed to that association. I heard him give a talk once many years ago in Berkeley when he considered himself a proud humanist as a member of the American Humanist Association. And he made a point of saying that the humanistic psychologists weren't humanists at all, according to his standards. So there was a real tension. The field of humanistic psychology, founded by people like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, actually also was the same group of people who founded the Association for Transpersonal Psychology, in which they endeavored to include the spiritual side of human nature in our psychological description of what it means to be human. And the American Humanist Association really was an outgrowth of the American Communist Party, actually. And it was, I think, their intention to eliminate any reference to metaphysics or the divine or the supernatural in their brand of humanism.
So that's a fascinating story, and it reveals the real tensions. And I was always attracted to those areas of psychology that you indicate, from Maslow and the transpersonal studies and Groff and all that. And that to me was much closer to the traditional idea of what a person was in a holistic sense. And in many senses, I think that was an effort to correct the positivistic behavioralism that had taken hold and was being instrumentalized, because this is the other factor, that there was an instrumentalization of concepts associated with the human and psychology, which I associate in particular with imperialism and the empire of scientism. And we see that going back to Thomas H. Huxley and the efforts to dispirit and to come up with new concepts that meant something slightly different than people think they do today, like what agnosticism meant. And we had that process of desupernaturalization, dispiriting, and in many senses, the movements that you talk about were an effort to recalibrate and to rebalance and to reflect a more holistic, ancient sense and a more real sense. And this is an ongoing struggle, because the reduction of the concept of the human is necessary in order to elevate the machine. And as the human is reduced to a small package, it's easier to say that consciousness exists in a mechanical form, because they have reduced the human to such a desiccated context. So these discussions are critical, and I urge people who describe themselves as humanists to be very aware of which brand they are subscribing to. So as I say, a lot of my friends are humanists, and I know that some of the issues that are very big at the moment, such as euthanasia, are being promoted, which I believe are being promoted for other means. But the humanism is being used as a vehicle to lubricate this argument, which is about something else. We also have the strange leverage of ectogenesis, children being born in machine contexts outside the womb, as predicted by Brave New World, as anticipated 100 years ago by J.D. Bernal in The World of Flesh and the Devil, as told as told also by Haldane in talking about Daedalus and the future. he was one of the advocates. So in the 100 years ago, they were planning ectogenesis. And now in 2023, if you look at the feminist literature, ectogenesis is being prescribed as the panacea for equality between men and women. So I argue that this is a spurious intellectual and equality drive, which really reflects a pre-existing desire. And I believe that a lot of academia is being co-opted in this, unbeknownst to some of them and beknownst to others, that they are doing the bidding of the military-industrial complex. Not consciously. They're not all doing that. Not all in the movement of posthumanism say things that are consistent with that. But in particular, what I call AI posthumanism or technological posthumanism, or if we look at the work of someone like Robert Pepperell, who wrote the Posthumanist Manifesto, it's clear that God is finished, nature is finished, and humans are finished, and the machine rises, and machine consciousness rises. And I don't understand whereby the opportunity or the base for a set of elite intellectuals came from in order to give them the prescription for a species suicide. 100 years ago, Churchill wrote an article, "Shall we all commit suicide?" And this was where he was anticipating that humans would destroy themselves with their fascination with technology when in the movement towards a new system. Although that explains also why he decided that the future empire would be an empire of the mind. He believed that you couldn't control people in the future, so therefore you had to have a physiological control of humans, which is what I'm arguing is happening. That the future is us being controlled by AI. And the AI proponents are saying that quite openly. In the last year or so, they're saying that humans will never be the same again, that humanity will never be the same again as a result of AI. So my anticipations were not crazy, and it's been justified by the experts in the area. They're telling us that we're over. So I don't understand why certain philosophical movements are supporting this. Certainly there is a funding connection that may explain some things, but in relation to the defense of our species, and it's getting difficult to defend your species because you'll be a speciesist, as Elon Musk found when he was talking to the head of Google. But I quite like humans. I'm not a misanthrope, and I want humans to do well. I want humans to evolve spiritually to the next level, to do all the things that you want them to do, to manifest their powers, to develop their compassion. I don't want to obliterate them in favor of a simulacrum, a machine simulacrum.
I wonder if so much of the push today to consider the human being as a machine, or worse, maybe just a cog in a much bigger machine, is that the religious traditions, which have been the standard means by which elites have attempted to control the population, I think is through religion, that those approaches have basically failed. We have huge numbers of people who are involved in orthodox, conventional forms of religion, but it seems as if there's a paradox, which is that the more pious you become in conventional terms, the less in touch you are with the real spirit of religion, or the mystical approach.
Yes, that's to some extent I agree, and to some extent I disagree. Certainly we've talked about the role of mysticism and the role of gnosis as a necessary fundamental aspect, in contradistinction to a type of ritualism and a type of rote and a type of automatism. But in relation to the growth of this machine idea, it's directly related to the demise of religion. because of its Prometheanism. In fact, if we think of the Promethean idea, which is core in all this, it's explicit in relation to the fundamental documents by Ibn Hassan about posthumanism. And they refer back to Gerald Feinberg in particular, who 68 and 69 wrote the Prometheus Project. And that in turn reflected what was happening in Britain in the 1920s. So he didn't pick it up off the ground, but his argument was that a human has no goals because they're accidental biological creatures, and therefore we need to have goals. And the goals would be technological, and they're remarkably consistent with what the guys in Britain said before that. But that Promethean idea, the idea of creating a telos through technology, became critical. But the rise is fundamentally related to that Promethean idea. And the Promethean idea doesn't say God doesn't exist. It's not an atheist position. It says God exists, but we're rejecting that higher concept, or we're going to rob this stuff from the gods. And that's a clear difference. It's clearly in the literature, this Promethean defiance. In relation to Daniel Dennett, who died recently, God rest him, he wouldn't appreciate that comment, but in relation to that, he said that religion was defined by a system of belief for a higher being that you needed to seek approval of. And this is a strange concept, the idea of seeking approval of. I believe that what the religious traditions are trying to do is to indicate a consciousness on which we come into accord with, because it's in some way inscribed in the universe, that we're not accidental, that there is meaning, that there is purpose, that there is persistence of the spirit, as you've explained in your work on the afterlife. So a interesting starting point is Dostoevsky, and he wrote a book it was published about 1873, although before that, in the couple of years before that, with various names, either called the possessed or the demons or the devils. And really it's about the alteration in a Russian town by political ideas. And he was anticipating what would happen really with the Russian Revolution, and he knew that there was something was going to happen. And he had been, we've talked about before, when he went to London, and he realized that there was a new kind of Baal associated with technology that was emerging. And if we connect his work with Alexander Solzhenitsyn and what Solzhenitsyn is talking about in the Gulag Archipelago, and what the old people said. They said that all this came about because we have rejected God. So whatever failings of religion, the idea that either there's no God in a kind of Nietzschean argument, there's no God and we have to exert our will, which is also Promethean, that the world is purely materialistic, was fundamentally related to the rise of these totalitarian doctrines. Whatever totalitarianism people want to ascribe to religion, it's usually massively exaggerated in comparison to what happened in the 20th century, despite all the things we want to point to. So in relation to the God concept and the rejection thereof, what it is an elevation of the will and cognitive function and the desires of the individual and the ego in a conscious way, so that there will be no impediment, no restraint. And it's interesting that if we compare the Prometheus legend, it's very, very similar to the Roman legend about the creation of humankind. But in the Roman version, we have Kura, who is concern and care, who fashions the human from the earth and is therefore the defining feature of the input into the dust and the earth that becomes the human that they return to in the end, owned by Jupiter or the other gods. And care and concern is the definition. So all of these issues come back to a broader conception of who are the humans, what relationship do we have to a higher force, and what is the nature of our being. So whereas that argument can be made, and certainly the Catholic Church were interested in automatons. They were in the medieval churches. There was loads of automatons. And in fact, then the aristocracy had in their gardens the automatons. And that was where first Descartes began to develop some of his ideas when he saw these ideas. And of course, he saw people as automatons in some sense. I believe that it was that scientific reduction that began to happen after Descartes that was manifest. In particular, we see it in Germany, and we see in the split in science. On one side, we see Goethe, and we could put Kant in there, and possibly Swedenborg and Coleridge, and they advocated a holistic, natural, philosophical approach. In Britain, we had a rejection of that by William Whewell and Babbage, the father of computers. And they came up with the idea then of the scientist, who was not the natural philosopher. And Coleridge was not in that gang. Now, Helmholtz was an important figure in the movement in Germany, and they identified the shift in Germany to 1847, to a very specific time. So we had a narrowing of the scientific method away from any commitment to the human as a broader subject, as moving much further away from the spirit into a purely materialistic sense. So I see it more as related to scientism, not science, but scientism, that we have this reduction. And I believe it's a product of that. And I believe that the religion is in some ways being rediscovered. And there is a philosopher, Richard Carney, an Irish philosopher, and Sheldrake was talking about him recently, and he has an idea of anatheism, which is a kind of return to God, but a different type of God. Now, I have issues with that as well, but so I don't see the it as an issue of created by a rigid concept of God, but rather created by a rigid rejection of a divine consciousness or a higher consciousness.
You also refer in your book to the great game or the smart game, and I gather that by that you're referring to the idea of being able to control all of humanity, and that this is what empires have striven to do throughout human history for different ways. And you suggest that there are layers and layers going on, so that people get caught up in these games, and they may believe that they're working towards one end, when in fact what they're doing is just the opposite of what they imagine it to be.
Oh, that's a very succinct statement. I couldn't have said it better myself, Jeffrey. Well done. Yes, I think the idea of homo ludens, or the idea of the human that is associated with a game or defined by the game is critical, and it's manifest in works like the Glass Bead game by Hermann Hesse, for example. And in many senses, I believe that his critique there was of an academic pursuit of wisdom, and an unduly ritualistic, which would include some of the religious views that you've talked about. I think that would fit into that context. So if we look back in the 18th century and we look at the Great Game, for example, as it was called, because the British Empire loved games, and the Duke of Wellesley said that battles were won on the playing fields of Eton. So Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. He was from Dublin, of course. But so games were critical. The British were fantastic at games, rules of games, international sport. Most of it we can trace back to the British Empire, whether it be soccer, golf, tennis, cricket. It goes on and on and on. It's quite incredible. So they're fascinated with games. The Great Game referred to the strategic conflict between the British Empire and the Russian Empire in particular, and it had nodal points in what's now Israel, Afghanistan, and the Crimea. Surprise, surprise. They continue today. So I say that what emerged with the transition of the empire in the 20s, when they began to say, well, we don't really want to continue with all these national wars of liberation. They got a bit annoyed with the Irish context and said, we're going to change the game. And they did, and this was anticipated in the work of H.G. Wells that we've talked about. So it's defined, or it's indicated by, in 1943, by Churchill in The Empire of the Mind. And I argue that fundamental in the ethos of the Atlanticist cooperation was the greatest game, which is the idea that they would achieve global governance, and they would achieve global governance which involved the technical control of human consciousness, so that the control of the mind by technical means would be the modus operandi of the new global governance system. So the greatest game is control of your consciousness. So people say, well, why did America invest so much money in Afghanistan, for example, and lose? And why are they investing in these wars and losing, for example? If we examine various theories about shadow government, deep state, etc., and if my view is correct about this commitment beyond the states to a global governance system, we're at a phase of a shift towards a risk taken to get the global governance system where the countries are going to be sacrificed. So the national governments are not committed to you. And there's quite a lot of evidence of that. It changed in my lifetime, and my family were very much involved in politics. So I saw it up close. So we have this top-down corporate transnational system, which is working through public-private alliances and international organizations, which transmuted the old empires into a neo-imperial system. And the object of that is to control your mind, to control it with technical means, through what I call endosymbiosis, coming into your body as the technology is increasingly available, down to the neural level where your nerves can be controlled with liquid crystals, with nanotechnology. That's all there. And your friend Jack Sarfati was talking recently about that he was convinced about Hameroff's, had something about the microtubules. And his theory is that you can apply a kind of Froelich coherence to a new android mind, that if you understand those principles and create what he described as, well, like Frankenstein, but we're at that phase again. So and now I'm not saying that he's involved in that, but he has in his public statements made clear about the interest of the national security state in mind control. That's what they have been interested for a while. They've been interested in that for hundreds of years. When Benjamin Franklin lived in London, it's interesting when they turned his house in Craven Street into a museum that you can visit. And when they were renovating in 1998, they found 1,200 pieces of bones in the house he lived in. And it was probably because there was an anatomy school there, there was a lot of illegal anatomy schools. But we see this fascination with anatomy, with politics, with the notion of how the body works. And we remember that Franklin was involved in investigating mesmer and animal magnetism. So from the 1750s, people associated with government and governance, and of course Benjamin Franklin was involved in the post office in the United States. People involved in communication, in networks, were interested in how they could exert influence on humans. And if we go back further, if we go back to 1658, and we see the work of Sir Thomas Browne, who's sometimes accredited with using the word electricity for the first time, he wrote a book which was largely about the quincunx, and it's called The Garden of Cyrus. And part of the title is called Network Plantation. This is 1658. So he was describing the power of networks, and in particular the 5-pointed, like a 5 on a die or a dice. This idea of a network or an X is critical in the thinking. And I believe that those explorations link directly to ideas of neural lace that we see in Ian Banks and Elon Musk, the idea of a lace around the brain to exert control. Of course, they always say it's to help disabled people, and nobody is against that. Everyone supports that. But really, most of this is about an effort to be able to govern the human being. So yes, the greatest game is what's going on. So when we can't understand, when the world is incomprehensible or seems incomprehensible, and you say, well, why is that happening? That doesn't make sense. It doesn't even make strategic sense. It doesn't make tactical sense. If you bear in mind that the greatest game is to secure global governance, and associated with that is to secure control of the human mind, a lot of things will make sense. And I believe that viewpoint will be revealed more and more, probably at a stage when we are so disempowered we won't be able to resist it.
You also seem to suggest that humanity as a whole is acquiescing unconsciously with these forces of AI and posthumanism that are acting in effect to destroy us, as if, for all I know, as if we have a death wish.
Yeah, there is some deep reason which I haven't been able to fathom because I don't recognize it. I don't recognize this acquiescence. I don't recognize this impoverishment of spiritual will that means that people either don't care, are willing to succumb to it, or really don't care whether they get the chip in the head and openly say that now. This is something that's unfathomable to me. And Jeffrey, in an Irish context, a lot of my father's family were involved in politics for a long time. Like my grandfather, he was in Parliament on 8 different occasions, and my uncle, the same name as me, and my uncle as well, was a number of times and held high political office. And my grandfather's brothers were in jail dozens of times for their fight for Irish freedom. And before that, they were involved in the land struggle and in the origin of the things. The time of the origin of the idea of the boycott came from the west of Ireland. I'm not saying them in particular, but that context. And some of the most famous hunger strikers, they knew them. I go back to my father's uncle's time. These people like Terence McSweeney influenced Ho Chi Minh, Mahatma Gandhi. They weren't playing on the periphery of there wasn't an insignificant thing they were doing. Someone sent me a clip yesterday about my grandfather in 1937 hired an aeroplane to drop leaflets about the new constitution over Dublin. But so they were deeply involved, and in recent times, all politicians have been smeared with the brush that they're on the take and that, which the recent generation, unfortunately, have been co-opted by corporate forces. No question about that. And that happened in particular, I would identify the 1990s, there was a takeover of politics by global forces, of national politics, because the nation state cannot stand in they are opposition to the New World Order, as H.G. Wells explained. So, in many senses, there's when I compare that really love of the country, opposition to empire as they saw it, it's incomprehensible to me how quiescent we have become, and there's no doubt that we have underestimated the power of television, of forces of pacification, of the falling in love with the servitudes that Huxley talks about. And this is a deep affect on people. It has a deep affect on people. And when we throw in that the deconstruction of both religion and conceptions of a higher order. Now, I don't, when I say about God and that, I don't seek to limit that in any narrow sense, in any sectarian sense, because we can all have different conceptions of God. But we're talking about a higher force from which we come from and to which we may return or not, as the case may be. But we're talking about the highest elements of ourselves, the holographic universe, as you've talked about with Michael Talbot, that which we are an image of or represent or encapsulate in ourselves, fractals of the higher force. Now, when you convince people that there's something much less than that, their cognitive function can be impaired. And now they are talking openly. NATO have its papers on neuro warfare. They're there to see in 2020. We have fifth generation warfare. The fifth generation warfare is not against people in some other country. It's against you. It's against their own people. It's quite remarkable. So the idea that they're quite open about that the next phase of warfare is about a massive control of the human mind. And this is a prelude to using the military-industrial complex to orchestrate a takeover of the human consciousness. And part of that is to draw us away from our inherent spiritual power, to confuse us, to demoralize us, to dispirit us, literally. So that is what is happening. That's a planned thing. We can see very, very clearly in the imperial effort that they had to destroy any religious systems, any nation states, and the family, because they were the main forces of opposition. And people say to me, I got an email just before I was talking to you, and a woman who's communicating with an interest in these issues. Why do you defend the state? Or appear to defend the idea of the state or the Westphalian state. And my answer would be that insofar as the New World Order are attacking the state, and insofar as history evolves over a period of time, once we relinquish any ability to have a democratic control over our affairs, there's no opposition towards a global government military context. So anything they're in favor of, I'm against, as a starting point to keep your finger, so the idea that there's all these benign forces that are going to regulate you when they have taken away rights that have grown up in your culture for hundreds of years, surely people can see through that. So the quiescence, there's no question about it.
In your view, what we're looking at is a situation where the governments and states are being superseded by a kind of global financial technocratic network involving AI that could eventually come to control everything, the traffic lights, the communication systems, the transportation systems, globally, that states will become superfluous.
Yeah. What's going to happen, Jeffrey, and we can test this in the future. We're going to have economic and financial collapse. When that happens, I don't know, but I don't think it's. I think it's closer rather than further away. That will be utilized to bring in digital currency associated with digital ID, and the central bank digital currencies are on the way. Plans are being made in Switzerland the last couple of years. Switzerland is a key nodal point in this for the transition. Switzerland is critical in relation to the management of a number of things, pharmaceuticals, pharmaceutical industry, etc., international migration, a whole range of force, World Trade Organization. So when we get the digital currency, then we have effectively a social credit system. Although there is regulation which purports, for example, there's a new AI Act come to a regulation in Europe that will apply to all Europe and affect people trading with Europe. And it purports to regulate AI, but they will never regulate the AI in a full context, and there's always public policy exceptions. So once you get the digital currency, then you have a social credit system, and we have a movement away from property as we know it, a programmable thing that can achieve other objectives. And once you have this connection where you're increasingly dependent on this node with the system, well, then it's easy to go to the next stage where we have an implantation, where we say, okay, it's difficult, the mobile phones don't always work and your access to the system. So then the external element of your connection, the external node comes into your body. And that comes into your body, and then it's over. Then it's over. And all of these systems are not intended for your convenience. They're part of this system. They were predicted, they were planned, they were part of this post-imperial context through international organizations, which many European empires were involved in. Many of these international organizations, food and agricultural organizations, UNESCO, again, Julian Huxley, They were intended and calculated to facilitate this process. So all of these things if these things happen, if you're operating a central bank digital currency or internationally, you can be sure that then there's another step after it, and the other step is the interpenetration of the mass technology into human consciousness, and it has been planned so.
There's always the fringe elements that seem to disrupt people's plans. For example, UFO phenomena, near-death experiences, the fact that human beings are incapable of being confined by rationalist systems.
Yes, but you can put a person in jail, Jeffrey, as I've just explained. I've talked to people, my father's uncles, who were put in jail. If you disagree with them, you can confine them. You can do things to them. Now we have capability of putting things in their nervous system. Instead of having an expensive jail, you can disable them with electronic means, electromagnetic means, liquid crystal means. So this is what Steiner talked about. The suppression of function is very, very possible. This is what the neuro warfare is about. We know that this has happened. This happens because they have told us in their own documents. This is what they're doing. This is what they're planning. This is what a lot of the functions that they're investigating are for. But we come to a situation, and then even if you look at some of the people you've talked with about UFOs, they say, oh yeah, because of all this UFO stuff, therefore we need transhumanism. You say, oh, hold on a second. You understand that these things can also be used to achieve those objectives. That's why H.G. Wells is suggesting the War of the Worlds, because he wants this new world order, and one great way to imply it or to move it forward is to suggest there's an alien threat. So that thing is always there. But then we have John Lilly. So John Lilly is another example of a person who worked on mind control, but also was identified with consciousness exploration, because the two of them went very, very close. And he had his idea of the solid state entity, which I think is very close to what could happen, but also of the other system, the Earth Coincidence Office, which would intervene or could intervene. So there is an opposing force. So there is the other force, whatever way you want to conceive it. And we've talked in the Marian apparitions, and the Marian apparitions suggest there will be an intervention. And the reason for the intervention will be because humanity is so lost. So I believe that this will happen, and even on the analogy of the near-death experience, because if humanity is dying, there will be, whether through, in a way like the Institute of Noetic Science talk about this consciousness linking, when the horror of the possibility emerges, there will be some kind of reaction. It will be very difficult to pull us out of the tailspin, but we have the possibility of a divine intervention. Now, a lot of people won't believe in that. They will believe in aliens because they're kind of things they think they can touch and feel, but they won't believe in the divine intervention. There will be some kind of possibility, or there's a lot of evidence of this idea of an intervention. And there is also the possibility of some realignment in the earth itself, which could also be propagated by the efforts to strip the earth of its natural balance. Insofar as, for example, we are sticking loads of windmills around the earth in a way which is like the acupressure points on the earth. If people believe that the earth as well as its lines of energy, there will be disruption. We have a lot of solar activity recently, and solar activity is linked to changes in the earth. We have the possibility, which we've talked about before, of a cold spell in the climate. We have now a lot of evidence about geoengineering. Last year, there was no geoengineering according to the scientists, and in recent reports, there's 50 countries engaged in geoengineering. So they are intervening in complex processes they do not necessarily understand how they work. So we have a hope that in some senses that we will get this intervention of some shape or form, but ultimately such interventions would still put us in the same position. The position is you have to choose who you are. You have to choose, in my view, and the choice is simple. You have to recognize that you are an individual with spiritual consciousness who is incarnated and therefore has to recognize the same force in other people and treat them accordingly, as well as other beings in the whole chain of being, to recognize them. Or you believe that you are some accidental piece of flesh and bone who has no free will, who just happens to be here, who can't do anything, who is going nowhere, who is a burden on the face of the earth, who is responsible for all the things that go wrong, and has a nihilistic view of the world. And even if something happens, if there is an intervention, for example, if you take in the Marian apparition, you'd still be faced with that choice. You'd still be saying, well, which path am I committing to? And some people may stay the same. So, I believe that that's happening. I believe that the contrast is going to be more and more severe, that really we may not agree on how we see the world or what's up there or what is the nature of God, or our theologies may be different, or our spiritual positions may be different. But the recognition of the reality of our spirituality is the commonality we should seek in order to evolve in a respectful way, in order to respect differences. And and the future demands we escape from that limitation, from the chrysalis. This is the time to evolve. This is what William Myers, who you've often talked about, this is what he was talking about moving on to the next phase. So I believe that those external forces will cause the reaction as more people begin to understand. And if someone reads your book about the afterlife and then they believe it, the next question, and I heard, I think it was Bernardo Kasparov saying about when he worked through his ideas on idealism and he began to understand the reality of the afterlife, then the question is, well, what is that, and how does that affect my behavior now? That's a different question, but we do have some indications from all the spiritual traditions that the sense of the world that we have here has implications for how we are there in relation to reciprocity, in relation to understanding the magnificence of what we have, and in relation to certain key values of care and compassion, for example, that these have implications in relation to our ability to progress to places we might want to go to.
I sometimes get the feeling that the universe itself is designed for this kind of mystical maturity that you're talking about, where people take responsibility for their own personal sovereignty and don't allow themselves to come under the influence of these various autocratic forces. But it seems that in order to accomplish that end, the universe has to constantly challenge us with these autocratic forces so that we can, over time, perhaps over many lifetimes, overcome them.
There is, I wouldn't put it in terms necessarily of a dialectic, because that can lead to other different senses, but there is certainly a sense that inherent in the universe is an adversarial dimension, a yin-yang, as you indicate with your symbol, which is inherent because without free choice, without actual choice, it will be meaningless. That the free will is real, and that certain people will choose a particular version as suits them. They will choose their own ego or their own will over other people, or the satisfaction of their own needs, for example. And that's allowed in the universe, and that's legitimate. But the universe says there are consequences of your decision making. And this is the Faustian bargain. This is the better version, not Goethe's version, but in relation to the truer version in some sense of Christopher Marlowe, that really you're going down after this, and Mephistopheles is clear about this and warns Faustus. Okay, you can get this, but we're taking you afterwards, and that's what happens afterwards. You're not going to escape it like you might with Goethe. This is the bargain. You're making you're making short-term sacrifices or hoping for short-term benefits, and you're sacrificing the long term because your spirit exists in the long term. So this issue of consequences is a thing that is important, and this is the essence of pragmatism. Is the essence, in its truest sense, of William James' philosophy, that we look at truth in relation to its effect, but also that things do have effects. If you don't look after your body, there's going to be deleterious consequences. We can't ignore that. We can't pretend otherwise. If you're interested in the truth, we can see that certain things we do have consequences. The spiritual universe always says that there is consequences for your actions. The great spiritual and moral leaders say that. And most of the things they're saying are about recognizing your spiritual identity and recognizing the spiritual identity of others. It's not rocket science. It's not a great, it's not beyond the comprehension of anybody. It's nothing different from what the psychotherapist, the Jewish psychotherapist in particular, who fled from Nazi Germany, explained about in the end, the utter importance of face-to-face recognition of the other human being. And that was and Goldstein and other people like that talked about the fundamental basic relationship. And they were right on that. They were reflecting a sense of, in Catholic terms, the holy face, recognizing the divine face before you, or till we have faces in C.S. Lewis terms. So I believe that is critical, that recognition of our own spirituality, recognition of others, and understanding that in some way we are a part of a bigger system. And then we can go on from there. We can look at the subtleties, but there are consequences. I think there's been too much idea, particularly in the 60s, that it doesn't matter and everything will be okay. But really, the spiritual traditions don't say that. They say you have to take responsibility. So I support what you say, and that self-enforced responsibility is very, very important. That's I won't say self-policing, but the self-responsibility is a critical part in that. Yes, for we must take the benefits of sovereignty, but we have to take the consequence, the costs as well.
You warn people that there's a kind of pincer movement taking place that we are largely unconscious of, and the two arms of the pincer are AI on the one hand and posthumanism on the other, a philosophy that ultimately tends to denigrate the human being.
Yes, they would say that they don't, and are trying to celebrate and protect minor or groups that are oppressed, etc. But I don't find that convincing. So, AI in many senses is a strategic force. It's a technical force. It's a phenomenon, and in many ways, we don't have to philosophize too much about its reality. We can trace it back. We can trace it back to Babbage and we can up to Turing and DARPA and the McCarthy and all those people. We can look at the heritage of it. We can look at the etiology and see it as a product of the military-industrial complex. See it as a product of the genius of rules that the British had and applying rules to machines and doing the same thing that the administrators were doing that came from the Industrial Revolution. Okay, we can mechanize work, and we can displace people. So the frames they use and the looms became the main frames in relation to information harvesting and processing. So the Luddites were reacting against that, but this same principle informed the industrial base of empire, which was manifested in the United States context through the work of people like Vannevar Bush, the Macy Conference, etc. And these were perfected over time. So artificial intelligence as a phenomenon cannot be talked about in any sensible sense as existing outside the military-industrial complex. It's just absurd. And even when we see companies like DeepMind that Google bought, their base actually was in Russell Square. Surprise, surprise. Like a lot of the recent books when I went to the university library, and I was reading some of the recent publications on posthumanism. They're all from Bloomsbury Publishing. It's not accidental historically. So AI is a product of the military-industrial complex. We can't get away from that. It's an illusion to think of that it's a free-floating force that exists in any other sense. Posthumanism is a philosophy which describes and supports that and purports to link it to the liberation of people that it doesn't actually believe in. So it uses certain groups and purports to be supporting them when really it's going to pull the carpet from all of them. It does so on the basis of our needs to recognize insects and that, on the basis of a limit, and animals, which I support. But in relation to insects, if we take the example, they claim that insects were never regarded in human philosophy, and they certainly weren't regarded in the European tradition. Whereas legal history proves that wrong. It's simply a spurious historical analysis, because there are buckets of cases in Europe. There are buckets of academic articles explaining how insects were parties to legal cases, particularly in France. There are loads of them. So the idea that insects weren't recognized by the system in some way is just historically false, as a lot of the suppositions are. The commitment to protect animals, again, I think, although it may be well intended, ultimately will be in effect spurious, because the technological posthumanism will destroy the environment. The environment is going to be destroyed in the creation of electrical systems necessary to sustain the solid state entity, if you like. It's going to utterly destroy. And even Elon Musk is saying that in a couple of years there'll be blackouts, because the amount of power necessary to run these AI systems is much more than we have. The green movement is not actually going to make the planet greener, as John Lilly actually anticipated. It's going to suck the resources out of society. So we have the phenomenon of AI with various philosophies and policies, including transhumanism, but posthumanism in particular, which is taking over, which has been presented in a way that appeals to certain groups but won't deliver that satisfaction, and ultimately is associated with the deconstruction of the human being, the self, and the dehumanization. I argue that's a very dangerous thing. And again, I say to the academics now that they have to begin to realize that they have to take consequences of what they're proposing. You'll have to stand by this over time, and the consequence. You can't contribute to this discourse and not stand by the work that you're doing. And ultimately, what we have is a thing that I described, I think, back in the 1990s, a fear, a concern I had from looking at international regulation. And again, I also worked with international organizations. So I'm not living in a basement somewhere coming up with these ideas, and I was contracted by international organizations. So in the 1990s, I said that the consequence of the tourism increase of the World Heritage Convention would be to create a ghost host community, that the host community will be displaced and be removed from the equation. So this idea of the ghost host, I think, is a useful one, because there's a lot of literature by people like Richard Carney, etc., on the idea of the host and its connection between the stranger, enemy, and guest, and a lot of advocacy in favor of privileging the stranger. And I support that. That's the basis of a lot of, well, the Good Samaritan. It's the basis of Christianity. Who is my neighbor? But it's not to the death of the host. This is not the objective of such respect for the stranger. It's not so that the host inevitably disappears from the equation. There's a similar process. This is the idea as well, the fear of possession, what Dostoevsky was indicating with a political ideology. So the takeover of nation states, for example, makes a ghost of the original host. And the same thing is happening. The same thing happened in the idea of terra nullius, that there was no people in Australia when the British arrived there. They disregarded them, and they could say it was empty land, mainly because they didn't have agriculture. That wasn't because of the colour of their skin. It was because they didn't have agriculture and weren't sufficiently developed. So what I'm arguing is that humans will be turned into ghosts. When you relinquish that sovereignty, that connection, that commitment to your own spirit, you will effectively, and the process will turn you into a ghostly figure, a spectre in the new world, and that it will be replaced by a reduced simulacrum, manifests in androids, robots, in cyborgs, in mass machine context, mass machine consciousness, collective consciousness, which is inconsistent with the spiritual traditions that I believe in, that I believe, for whatever strange reasons, that we are individual entities and that will persist. And this is a lot of people don't believe that. A lot of people believe we're drops of water, we move into the next world, and we become something, we become the whole thing. I don't think it's quite like that. If you look at, again, Kastrup is interested in his idea of you've talked many times, the disassociation from the great mind, and then presumably a reassociation. But just think of it in this way. Imagine that we're composed of two elements, like we're like water in the spiritual context, and that when we come into this domain, the hydrogen and oxygen separate in some way. But in order to persist on their journey into the afterlife, as you describe, they have to ultimately recombine. They have to be come back together, or they won't be able to persist on their journey. If one of the elements is bound to something else, that won't be able to happen. All of the spiritual traditions forbid or warn you against becoming or having part of you bound to some other element, whether it's against Satanism or Ahrimanism for Steiner, or any other idea of possession, or it's don't commit yourself to something materialistic, because you won't be able to progress spiritually. So I suppose by using an analogy, or a simple analogy with Kastrup's thing, our reassociation as in this life, pending our journey onwards, may be impaired by our being bound to the material world, that there is a spiritual system, which also, when I was looking at your recent talks on neurodiversity, I found very, very interesting, because it posited these, or dramatized in some sense, although it's real for the subjects, it dramatized a broader issue of to what extent can we give ourselves up, or allow ourselves, or manage other entities within us. Now, in most spiritual traditions, they warn against that. Now, I know about all the medical conditions and dissociative identity disorder and all those things, so I'm not talking about that, but it's the more general issue of, or going back to William James's studies with different beings coming into other beings, that there's a fundamental issue about what it is we're meant to be doing here, and how we manage that, and how we commit ourselves to that.
Well, James, we've covered a lot of ground here. It does seem as if the ultimate message is the antidote to becoming dehumanized is to be on a spiritual path, to get in touch with one's own inner nature. Absolutely,
Jeffrey. I think, as I've said many times, and I'll continue to say it, that I think what your work is doing is trying to indicate the reality of things that materialist science regards as immaterial. And my desire is to is to contribute towards the reality of spiritual evolution, to bring people together from different traditions. Not that they relinquish their traditions, but we begin to understand that because there's an existential threat to the spirit of all people that have a tradition, or all people that recognize themselves as spiritual beings, that we have to get over our differences. We have to really vindicate and advocate the reality of spiritual consciousness. We have to begin to work out some higher level principles that can that can allow us to align in some formation that can help us to go to the next level in a way which doesn't involve our subjugation by clandestine forces, which doesn't involve our slavery and our demise. And I think I intend the vindication of spiritual consciousness to be a positive, because without it, as a lot of people are suffering from the despair and alienation associated with the industrial society, that really it's also the antidote towards the despair that a lot of people are suffering, and also that they shouldn't be dragged into a Vietnam War scenario of getting engaged in other people's games without frontiers and all that stuff. We shouldn't be dragged into a lot of sideshows by Sideshow Bob or whatever form he appears. We shouldn't be sucked into Tweedledum, Tweedledee scenarios where there's no difference between the forces that we are told have dramatic differences. A lot of that is false, because they are distractions from the bigger issues. If we commit ourselves to the reality of spiritual consciousness, we will also open ourselves up to the value of inspiration and the value of and the possibility of real intervention in our lives from the higher forces as well, which will be part of the corrective mechanism. And it will be through that process that humans will move on to the next level, because ultimately, whatever numbers, humans will survive largely in the form in which they are, and they will concentrate in evolving spiritually, getting whatever benefits they can from science, but they will concentrate on the development of their heart and their mind as well. And that is the next stage of evolution. And the greatest threat to that is our worshipping of the idol of technology and technique, and our willingness to succumb to governance. So yes, I hope it's a positive message, but really as well, when we see all the dark things happening, if we can make sense of them, we're empowered, Jeffrey. I think once people begin to understand and the analysis works and it becomes predictable, say, okay, I understand that now. And they also understand what the opposing force necessary is, a non-violent force. We will begin to be able to advocate, convince, to persuade, and to unite as well. I know that's not a popular word these days, but to set aside our differences and to begin to move on to the next level, and not to get sucked into battles that are meaningless ultimately.
I like the word unite. I think it's a recognition that we're all entangled with each other in any case. Well, James Tunney, this has been a fascinating excursion into social reality, technical reality, and spiritual reality as well. Once again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being with me today.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. I appreciate the opportunity, and I look forward to further conversations. Thank you.
And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here. Book 2 in the New Thinking Aloud Dialogues book series is a tribute to parapsychologist Russell Targ, celebrating his 90th birthday. New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos.